I held the silver spoon in my hand and listened while my sister-in-law listed credit card debts like prayer requests, loud, public, and entitled. My name is Hattie Mae Green, and I am 62 years old. Before I share how they lost everything because of their own entitlement, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe it's time for us to stop carrying everyone else and start protecting our peace. I smiled, poured myself another glass of sweet tea, and watched them draw plans on the tablecloth as if the house and the insurance were theirs to divvy up. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the kitchen smelled like my Sunday pot roast and the lemon cake my husband used to call too sweet for a sermon. For 38 years, I cooked for the family, patched holes in their lives with my credit cards, and greeted every emergency as though it had been sent specifically to my door. They showed up on my porch when the heat bill was high, when the washing machine died, when a car refused to start in the rain. My checkbook opened like a hymn book. My husband, Robert, Bobby to me, was the kind of man who left small, stubborn notes in the cookie jar. Pay no mind to the noise, keep your head, love louder. I loved louder, until loving louder felt like the only work I was allowed to do. After Bobby's funeral, the house filled with cousins I hardly knew, and a loud cousin with a louder laugh named Marcus, who immediately offered to take care of the paperwork. He set his briefcase on my grandmother's antique table like he owned it, and the same cousin who ate 3 helpings of my sweet potato casserole declared he would handle the estate. That was the first time someone in that room treated paperwork like a social favor and me like a decorative figure. I smiled and handed out napkins. The pastor offered a prayer, and someone clinked a glass and made a joke about how Hattie always keeps the best recipes but never the receipts. People laughed. I kept my hands folded so they wouldn't shake. Within a week, I was the family emergency hotline. My niece, Tasha, called to ask if she could borrow money for a security deposit, while my brother-in-law, Leroy, showed up on a Tuesday looking for a place to stay real quick. I drove them to the bank, signed forms as a trusted reference, and fielded calls from collection agencies that had the same tone as old friends. Every favor I did felt spooled through an invisible rule book. Keep the family together, smile through it, and if you must grumble, do it quietly. I told myself Bobby wouldn't have wanted me to fuss. I told myself that one more sacrifice was only temporary. On the Sunday after the funeral, we had a repast. The house was full, and the air tasted of fried chicken and cheap cologne. As cousins compared bank interest rates, I heard for the first time a plan laid out with arrogance instead of gratitude. "We'll just take his policy payout and wipe all this out," Cynthia said, tapping a coffee cup like a gavel. "Credit cards? Gone. Houses? Paid. Hattie won't even have to touch it." There was a laugh, and I felt the same old pull in my chest, an old familiar ache I had learned to carry alone. The family assumed my marital grief came with a side of incompetence. I folded the napkin again, let the conversation run like a train they were certain would never derail, and I poured another cup of tea. Later that evening, after visitors left and the house settled into quiet, I sat with Bobby's old cardigan on my lap and a folder he had left, just one he had tucked under his sock drawer as if forgetting. The folder was full of papers with his tidy, small handwriting and one line underlined with his fountain pen. Hattie Mae Green, primary beneficiary, do not jeopardize. My hands trembled, not with anger, but with something like a ripple of relief. It answered one question: had he left anything? And it raised another: did anyone else know? The answer, I suspected, was no. That night I slept like I hadn't in weeks, not because the world was fixed, but because for the first time in a long time, an obligation belonged to me alone, to honor what Bobby and I had quietly built. A week later, an envelope arrived with the VA's letter confirming benefits. The house echoed with the sound of callers trying to remind me of what family is for. I could feel the old gravitational pull. The neighborhood church ladies brought casseroles and offered to sit with me on Sunday. They said the right things about healing and community, but I could hear the undercurrent. Someone had to be available. Someone had to be patient. And in their estimate, that someone would always be me. That was the pattern. The longer I followed it, the more I lost myself in the roles everyone else assumed I existed to play. Several days after the repast, Cynthia announced at lunch that she and Marcus had already spoken to an attorney and were sorting out the payout distribution. Her voice had the soft dismissal of someone used to doors opening for them. "We can list the house, Hattie, or we can leave it as a family Airbnb," Marcus said, chuckling like it was a joke. I watched the way they assumed my consent without asking. "You don't have to worry. We'll take care of everything," Cynthia added, folding her napkin with precise hands. The arrogance landed like cold rain. I set down my fork, answered with a small smile, and said nothing. That night, my neighbor, Miss Loretta, a widow with a sharp eye and a love for crossword puzzles, came by with a plate of banana pudding and a worry she couldn't hide. "They talkin' like you need a sitter, baby," she said, "but paper don't wiggle. Look at what's in his drawer." I told her about the folder. She hissed out a laugh I understood. Documents could be louder than words. Still, the family chatter grew bolder. They began arriving earlier, staying later, rearranging cushions on the parlor couch as if they were moving into a hotel where they had already booked the best room. Then the phone call came that showed exactly how deep their entitlement ran. My nephew Darnell called from his car in a shaky voice. "Aunt Hattie, Cynthia says the payments are coming from the policy. She said you said it was all right when you signed the forms." For a moment, I wondered what forms he meant. My stomach tightened because the family had already started inventing paperwork in conversation. I told him calmly that I had not signed anything, that the policy named me, and that no one had authority to spend a dime without my say-so. He stammered and said Cynthia had said otherwise. I could hear the confidence in Cynthia's voice through the line like a shadow. A few days later, at a cousin's suggestion, Marcus invited himself to help catalog Bobby's tools and books. He opened drawers that used to hold the letters Bobby wrote me in the dark of the night when he first loved me. My silence felt like a shield. But then Cynthia, in front of the whole living room, like a woman announcing a casserole recipe, said, "Hattie, we're just saving you the trouble. Let us be the ones to handle bank calls. You need rest." The words were sugar-coated robbery. I thanked her for the concern and told her I appreciated the help, nothing more. She left thinking she had guided me to safety. She had not. One evening, Marcus, emboldened, asked me to sign a document he slid across the coffee table, just to acknowledge receipt of heirloom items, but didn't give me time to read it. "Hattie, it's easier if you just initial there," he said, pointing with the same hand that had helped himself to my pie. I refused. I didn't refuse with fury. I refused by setting my teacup down with deliberate calm and saying, "No, Marcus, I would like to read it." He looked taken aback, as if I had refused a customary kindness. It wasn't anger that rose then. It was a clear, cold awareness that the people I had sheltered with my patience were practicing a new form of ungratefulness, legal entitlement by suggestion. There was a last small cruelty that clipped the edges of my composure like a pair of blunt scissors. At the next family dinner, Cynthia announced she had already booked a caterer for the estate meeting. "We'll handle the paperwork," she said again, like an incantation. Someone else laughed. Someone else confirmed. Heads nodded. I felt my throat go dry. Later, alone in the parlor, I opened the folder again and found a small sticky note Bobby had left. "Don't let them rearrange what we built." There was no dramatic shouting, no slamming doors, just a quiet agreement among them that I was the kind of woman who would swallow indignity because I had swallowed it before. That was the moment my silence shifted from endurance to something else, something that felt like a decision. The very next morning, I drove to Marlene Tate's office with the folder in the glove compartment and an old brass key I had found taped to the back of Bobby's sewing box. Marlene had been our family's attorney for years, a woman with a steady voice and a laugh that did not flee when things got messy. When she read the trust papers and saw Bobby's clear designation, her face softened with the kind of respect that knows the law but values history. "Hattie," she said, "he did this right. The trust names you sole beneficiary. He didn't leave room for the executioner to pick through it." That first new fact answered the question, was I legally in control? And raised another, what would happen if I exercised that control? Back at the house, I started with small administrative acts that felt huge. I called the insurance company, spoke to a woman with a polite voice and a number that made my heart beat a beat faster. I confirmed the payout, the beneficiary, and the instruction on the policy that it be transferred to the trust. I canceled any automatic drafts set up by relatives and told the mortgage company that the executor was me and that all future communications be in writing. I left messages for colleagues of Bobby's and told them to direct calls to Marlene. Those were practical moves, but each one rewired the assumption that I was an endless resource. A quiet plan unfurled. I took the brass key to the old hotel safe deposit, where Bobby had kept one box of papers, including a signed deed and the code to a small private vault in the back of the attic, an old thing Bobby joked was his man cave safe. The vault was heavy and smelled faintly of cedar and pennies. Inside were older deeds, sealed letters, and a copy of a private trust agreement that Bobby and I had once, in a soft half-joke, called our little bank. I made copies, notarized documents, and handed everything to Marlene. She drew up an immediate transfer to a trust-managed account and suggested we move the assets temporarily to a specialized account for protection until all claims were cleared. "You need to stop the drip," she told me. "Stop the favors until people prove they deserve one." At home, I began to pull the steady threads of my life back into my own hands. I canceled the automatic grocery order. I changed the combination to the safe, quietly, with the locksmith who had come when Bobby first fixed the sink. The locksmith asked if everything was all right, and I said, "Yes, we're rearranging." I arranged help to move people who had moved in under the assumption we had agreed to their stay. I wrote a calm, plain letter to Cynthia and Marcus. "Please vacate the premises within 7 days. I will have legal notices served. This is not personal. This is necessary." The message landed like a stone dropped in a pond. Its ring reached everyone. Packing was not dramatic. I took Bobby's shirts off their hangers and folded them with slow, precise hands. I packed only what I needed and placed photographs in a box, pictures of Sunday dinners, of Bobby dancing with me in the kitchen, of our hands clasped at church. The act of packing answered the question, would I walk away from the roles I had been given, and created a new one? Could I stand alone? I did not shout or throw plates. I signed documents. I closed accounts. I stopped sending money. On the night before the notices went out, I sat on the back porch with my tea, listening to the cicadas sing like a choir. The house was full of memories that wanted to be saved, but my hands felt clear and unburdened. When Marlene called to tell me the transfers were complete and the trust accounts were secure, I felt an emotion that looked like cold clarity, loss braided with relief. I slept with the bedroom window cracked, the hush of the street like a promise of a life not entirely other people's to choreograph. The next morning the process began. The attorney filed for immediate auction if necessary, sent certified letters, and the sheriff's office prepared the legal notices. I walked through the house and touched the door frame Bobby had measured when we first moved in and closed it behind me. The lock clicked like a punctuation mark. The legal notices hit like a winter storm. Within 48 hours, Cynthia called, voice thin with anger and panic. "Hattie, what are you doing? You can't do this." I answered calmly and said, "I can, and I have, Cynthia." I did not explain. I listened while she tried to bargain, promising things she had never committed to before. "We'll get you anything you need," she said, like a politician promising infrastructure. Her voice trembled because the tide had turned and she had no anchor. The next morning, a lawyer representing a creditor called Marcus. His surprise at the notice of the vacate order sounded hollow and a little desperate. One claim led to another, leases that had been assumed, apartments they had counted on whose payments suddenly bounced. As their world shifted, small practical consequences compounded. A car repo man called Darnell in the middle of the night. The landlord in Charlotte dialed Marcus with a legal notice. Someone else, who had been living on the promise of an expected payout to clear medical debt, suddenly had that safety net pulled from them. The family began to discover the fragility of plans built on borrowed certainty. The creditors' calls were real. The bank notices came, and the people who had planned their lives around my silence found themselves accounting for overdue balances they had never intended to settle. Then an unexpected twist landed. A stack of papers arrived at Marlene's office from a private investigator I had retained in the background weeks earlier after smelling the rot of entitlement. The investigator had uncovered a pattern. Someone had been forging Bobby's signature on small withdrawal slips and using an old night deposit box he had access to. The forgeries matched handwriting samples of a woman who had been seen lingering around my house during the repast, Cynthia. Marlene held the copied slips, the receipts, and a timeline that matched withdrawals to dates when Cynthia had reasons to help Bobby. When the news came to Cynthia, she went pale like a sheet. The family that had assumed moral superiority now faced something ugly, legal consequence. Charges were possible. People who thought they were simply taking what love would have given them discovered their behavior had real-world costs. Words spread quietly at first, then louder. Neighbors who had once whispered sympathy now dialed numbers to verify their own vulnerability. Marcus deleted social media photos of the repast as creditors began public notices. Darnell called, crying, because a car was gone and there was no way to replace it without money he no longer had. I watched from the small safety of my kitchen, pouring a cup of tea, the steam rising between me and the house once full of chatter. I felt no joy in their panic, only a cold, steady relief that the enabling had stopped and natural consequence had begun. One afternoon, as the auction notices were posted on the front door, a legal step to force resolution, Cynthia tried to force herself through the kitchen door. She clutched a grocery bag like proof of domesticity. "Hattie, I need," she started, but I met her at the island with the box of Bobby's shirts, my voice soft but immovable. "Your things will be arranged through the notice," I said. "I cannot be your bank." She opened her mouth like someone trying to find a prayer, then shut it. There was no dramatic collapse. There was a small human surrender. The courthouse calls, the bank letters, the repo notices, those were the instruments of natural consequence. I had not yelled. I had not humiliated anyone. I had let the law and the truth do the work for me. By the time the auction date arrived, the house had a hollow sound. A few relatives had left quietly overnight, suitcases under the bed and apologies left on my kitchen counter. Others were turned out, faces tight with embarrassment and the real cost of relying on the generosity they had assumed was endless. Cynthia came to the front gate one morning, shoulders folded, asking for mercy in a dozen soft ways. "Please, Hattie," she said, "just a loan. We'll make it right." I looked at her for a long time and saw the woman who had eaten my pies and treated my grief like a budget line item. I felt the old urge to make things easy. Then I remembered the sticky note in Bobby's handwriting. I remembered every unpaid favor, each assumption. "Bless your heart," I said, and my voice was calm, like a measured bell. "I'm sorry, Cynthia. I'm done." There was no theatrical speech, no public shaming, no taunt. She began to cry small, embarrassed tears, and I reached out and patted her hand, because human beings break sometimes, and perhaps she needed a human touch. Then I closed the gate. That was the final boundary, kindness without collapse. She left without a promise. The people who had crawled back asking for money found the door closed. They wrote letters, left voicemails, but none of it changed the legal reality. Marlene had been careful and thorough. The auction proceeds paid creditors as required. Whatever was left went into the trust for maintenance and for me to live on. No one got more than they were entitled to. Nobody's life was rescued by my checkbook anymore. They had to answer their own creditors and their own choices. The natural consequences were not dramatic fireworks. They were a slow, precise accounting. My healing began in small, ordinary gestures. I moved out of the house not in a hurry but with intention, taking a few boxes, a hummingbird feeder, and Bobby's record collection. The penthouse overlooking the ocean was not some overnight fantasy. It was the careful choice of a woman who wanted quiet and sun and windows that opened to breath. I sat on the balcony with my coffee in the mornings and watched the gulls make their own small appointments with the wind. I began to go to a Wednesday prayer circle that met at 9. No long sermons, just a few women with steady eyes and better casseroles than a church kitchen. I took up a small garden on the rooftop where I planted lettuces and a rosemary bush Bobby would have liked. Once, Marcus knocked on my door, hat in hand, head lowered. "Hattie," he said, voice hoarse, "I don't know what to say." I smiled, not the forgiving smile I had given for years, but a softer, more accurate version, the kind that honors what was and refuses what was poisonous. "Take care, Marcus," I said. "Find your footing." He walked away before he could beg. On Sundays, I still go to church, but I sit differently now. Hands folded not because I am bracing, but because I am choosing to be present to myself first. Sometimes Miss Loretta stops by and we sip tea and watch the ocean. Sometimes Darnell calls to say he finally got a second job and that he's coming by with a pay stub. I listen. I don't rescue. I ask how he plans to manage, and I help him homework his budget, because compassion without enablement is the kind of help that lasts. The last image is small and plain. One morning on the penthouse balcony, I hung Bobby's small wind chime, a thing he won at a church raffle years ago, on a hook, and its soft, tuned notes threaded through the salt air. A neighbor called across the terrace to introduce herself, and we laughed at something small and domestic. I took my cup of coffee, looked out at the ocean, and felt the slow, bright work of unhurried days. The vault was still behind me in the letters and the lawyer's files, a legal fact, a closed chapter. And the house in Savannah had been put up for auction as necessary. The world continued in its messy human way. I folded my hands over my cup and listened to the chime. My life, at last, was partly mine to keep.